back to Block TV. Well, Crypto Twitter serves us a never-ending stream of information, thoughts, and discussions about the world of cryptocurrency. It's a mammoth task keeping track of it all, but fortunately we're joined every week by Nathaniel Whittemore, who lives and breathes the ecosystem and combines all the best of the best into his long read Sunday column. Nathaniel, firstly, thanks so much for being back with us this week.
Yeah, great to be here.
All right, so kicking us off with your first theme for this week, that's the Prog proof of work debates that are taking place all across the Ethereum network. Break this one down for us here a bit, because there's some technical elements that some of our viewers might not be fully on top of.
Sure. So for anyone who's not interested in Bitcoin and coronavirus, I hope you enjoy this segment because it's the only one that's not. But the Prog POW debates, I think, are really interesting for a few reasons. So basically, Prog POW is an alternative consensus mechanism for Ethereum, or proposed alternative that would limit ASIC miners and basically be more beneficial to GPU miners, right? So the arguments in favor of it is that ASICs increase centralization in the network. They harm small kind of individual miners and potentially threaten decentralization. And this conversation has been happening for a couple years, right? Ever since Bitmain put out an Ethereum ASIC miner, but it got heated back up a couple of weeks ago because on one of the Ethereum all core devs calls, they seemed to go forward or suggest that they were going forward with Prog POW as part of the next update to Ethereum, despite large-scale opposition or dissension within the broader Ethereum community. And so the conversation, the debate that ensued was a lot about, I think, three things. First, there was a question of process, right? How decisions get made. Because for a lot of folks in the Ethereum community, a few months ago, there was a dust-up around Prog POW, and it seemed very clear then that there was not broad consensus in the community that this was the right move for Ethereum. So part of the contention was around process and how decisions get made. Another part is power, right? And relates to who has power in the network. And this actually, in this context, has multiple dimensions. There's the power dimension of miners themselves and what Prog POW would do to power in the network, potentially limiting the power of large kind of corporate interests and benefiting smaller miners, at least theoretically. But then also power, again, in terms of who has the power to make decisions, who has the power to push things forward. A lot of the folks in this community felt like they weren't being heard, and even that their role was being diminished. Even Vitalik tweeted out, he was mentioning something about the problem with the process, saying that the way that it was, quote, ninja reapproved wasn't going to give a lot of people confidence. But then he kind of dismissively, at least some people thought it was dismissively, mentioned the Twitterati and how they feel like they now have to signal very loudly and clearly together. And people took that Twitterati as something of an insult, right? As though the community of people who were building things and who weren't just developers were just talking heads, right, on the Twitter box. But the last piece of this, and I think the most important piece ultimately for outside observers and everyone else who's not just in the community, has to do with DeFi. Ever since basically the end of last year, there's been a growing argument, a growing belief that DeFi cannot afford an Ethereum chain split, right? That the composability of apps has created an externality, which is that it would be very challenging to have parts of that system break and not have it be just catastrophic for everyone else. And really, I think at core of this issue for a lot of people is that a Prog POW update was likely to be so contentious that it could produce a chain split. And DeFi is just too important now. And I think that really what we're seeing in some ways is something I call the birth of protocol conservatism, where once protocols have something that is important enough to actually preserve, to need to exist, and is in fact more important than new changes that might be good, but that create unknowns and create threats to that underlying core. I think DeFi has become that for Ethereum. DeFi is where the network puts a lot of its kind of future ambitions. And in the same way that Bitcoin is unwilling to threaten core parts of what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin, I think Ethereum is going to be increasingly less willing to risk the underpinnings of DeFi. So a really fascinating debate with tons of dimensions, and I think is bigger than Ethereum in the sense of, you know, DeFi potentially being bigger than Ethereum, but also these questions of power and process that are certainly not unique to any one protocol community.
Certainly, as you say, the more you gain, the more you potentially have to lose. Much more at stake as the network continues to grow, and as you say, as the DeFi network in particular continues to find some sort of stability, whether that's in question or in doubt, one to watch closely. But let's turn now to your next theme for this week, one you've titled "Demonstrating Market Sickness," and we'll delve, as you alluded to in your intro there, that we will be discussing a lot about coronavirus, about the latest in global markets. This is certainly the first dipping of toes into that, and a look at how there seems to be a lack of clarity, as it were, in wider equity markets. A lack of reality, perhaps, is a better term to use. Break down what your thoughts were on this, Nathaniel.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that has been fascinating to watch is that coronavirus has been something that people have been talking about since the end of January, really, and certainly that chorus has risen in February. In February, we saw mass scale quarantines of people in the manufacturing center of the world. Yet markets were continuing to reach all-time highs, right? And there was a great podcast, the Hidden Forces podcast, a couple of weeks ago that had Ben Hunt from Epsilon Theory and Grant Williams, who's one of the co-founders of Real Vision. And they had this interesting disagreement where basically Grant Williams pointed out this disparity between all-time highs in Western stock markets and millions of people quarantined in the manufacturing center of the world. And his argument was that the markets were just wrong. Ben Hunt pushed back and said that actually it wasn't that the markets were wrong, it's that the markets don't mean what we think they mean anymore. They don't mean what they used to mean. They used to be a way of accounting for value on the basis of the potential for future dividends. They are no longer that. In his estimation, they are simply a political scorecard and reflect whether the government has done their job of kind of juicing them to positive outcomes. And I think that was a really interesting push. And so finally, what we saw last week is that the markets actually broke, right? The coronavirus fears were no longer contained, and it really started to break out into the markets. We saw the fastest correction in stock market history, meaning the fastest 10% drop in recorded history in the stock markets, just something like 10 or 11 days after reaching all-time highs. So it's a wild and weird time, but I think that part of what happened last week is as the markets did react, people started to say, well, why the hell weren't they reacting earlier?
All right, and that segues us neatly into your next theme for this week, and I want to bring that into the conversation, which is just titled "The Crash," and perhaps an important focus on what we did see last week, and the fastest 10% correction that has been seen in the history of U.S. equity markets. A dramatic time, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and yet, just to bring this currently into this week, we did see the week kick off with a pretty significant correction. Now, whether that holds or not is an interesting matter, but what's your take on how this is playing out? Is the house of cards coming down, or is this just a dip on a continued bull run that seems to be unstoppable?
I think that anyone who says they know for sure what the outcome of all of this is full of it. But I think that what happens is we get new evidence that shows where we are. So I think that in a lot of ways, last week, the point that many people were making was that this showed just how fundamentally fragile and perhaps based in disreality some of our market fundamentals were. And it felt like the real underpinning issue of all of this wasn't just that coronavirus was bad, and it wasn't just that China's manufacturing was going down. It's that the underpinning of the entire economy is sort of a presumption of government interventionism, which has inflated asset prices far more than they should be valued, and that corrections were likely to be more vicious because of that. Now, the flip side is kind of what we're seeing this week, where by the end of the week, by the end of Friday, you had high-ranking officials from central banks around the world indicating to the markets that they were likely to intervene, right? They were likely to start to provide liquidity in these markets in different ways, and the markets bounced back on that assumption. Now, what'll be really interesting to see this week is how long central banks can get the benefit of intervention without actually having to intervene, right? I wouldn't be surprised if you see a real stringing along where, the Fed basically says, we're standing by, we're poised to act, we're ready to go, until they actually have to. Because in some ways, what we've seen in the last 24 hours is that this is all about, like Ben Hunt said, it's all a political scorecard. And so there functionally might not be in the short term that big a difference between the Fed actually acting and the Fed saying they're going to act, other than once the Fed acts, it's much harder for it to act again, which is, I guess, fundamentally the challenge and the problem with the end game of this entire approach to the Fed's relationship with markets and central banks' relationship with markets. So I think it's going to be an equally weird week, but in very different ways, but still very revealing about this underlying challenges of economies that are just used to central banks being a key actor day to day.
And I want to touch back on that theme, but we'll save that for your other theme, which relates to this issue. So let's jump for a moment to your next theme for the week, the reassessing of that whole safe haven narrative back in the crypto space, that Bitcoin is indeed this safe haven asset expected to rise when other markets fall. We clearly saw that not playing out last week during a dramatic session in which that whole there was a decoupling of the notion, or rather a coupling of standard equity markets to crypto markets via Bitcoin. What does that say about the entire narrative of the safe haven? Is it dead, or is there still some potential life in that notion for Bitcoin?
Man, I have a lot to say about this, but I think there's a few things. First, the safe haven narrative, I believe, has been uncomfortably lumped together over the course of the last year with the uncorrelated asset narrative. And the reason that these two things can get lumped together is that in both cases, right, if you have an asset that is uncorrelated from markets, and you have an asset that, on the other hand, that is a safe haven, right? So it's negatively correlated, inversely correlated with other markets. Both of them could have the impact of being a good place to be when the rest of the correlated markets are going down. However, they're very different in terms of what they actually predict for, right? A safe haven asset is going to predict for something to rise, whereas an uncorrelated asset is just that. It's uncorrelated, so you don't know at any given time. But on a long enough time scale, you would expect that an uncorrelated asset is going to be a good hedge against the kind of ups and downs of the market. So when people like Chamath Palihapitiya, who went back on CNBC and reiterated his 1% of your net worth should be in Bitcoin, which he's been saying since 2013, he was very clearly making the point that this is from the standpoint of an uncorrelated asset and a long-term hedge, not a short-term kind of hedge against stock market volatility. Which brings us to another point, which is that people started to remember again that when we're talking about safe havens, there are, and even inversely correlated assets, we have to make clear what we're talking about that correlation to. Are we talking to correlation to stocks? Are we talking about safe haven from monetary debasement, right? Like the point of all of this is that I think we've been very loose with our terms, and that's for a couple reasons. One is, I think over the last year, there have been a few moments, right? These few kind of eye-popping moments where Bitcoin did go in the exact opposite direction of the stock market. Like I think there was a couple times around trade war announcements, and that's good enough to get a CNBC clip. When that happens, we have a natural tendency as a community that is rooting for these technologies, and let's be clear, we are, to want to amplify that message. And so it's a useful kind of question and an interesting question for media to ask, and the mainstream media, I mean, and it's something that we want to amplify. And so we get into this situation where we're kind of loose with our terms. I feel like last week was a real resetting of the terms of the dialogue around safe haven. The last piece of this that I'll say, I guess, is that it's not necessarily the right idea to look at safe havens in general in, day over day or even week over week movements, right? Gold had its biggest loss since 2013 on Friday of last week, right? When markets get really pummeled, it tends to pummel everything. And if it were a catchy enough term, safe haven assets would probably be called like less bad than the rest of the crap assets, but that's not what they're called. So I think it's hard to dismiss an entire narrative, but I do think that the narrative got some important course correction last week.
Certainly some important course correction. And I suppose just to touch deeper on that for a moment, as well, an idea that there is this notion of a tendency towards narratives on an asset class that is still, only just hit the double digits in terms of its age. I mean, is it perhaps just misguided to try and assert a narrative strain into it, despite the tendencies of people who want to categorize, but into the crypto world, into Bitcoin specifically, on an asset that is so young and is yet to prove its fidelity, whether as a safe haven, whether as an uncorrelated asset, whether as a correlated asset matched to standard equities? Is it still just perhaps too soon?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's never not going to be narratives. You could have an asset that's 10 days old and it's going to have narratives placed upon it. Narratives are the way that we make sense of things. So it's not so much that. I think that the question is really how much credence, how much strength we give those narratives, right? How much explanatory power we give those narratives versus being more in a position of viewing them as all competing in some ways, right? And every new event becomes a bit of evidence for one or the other. And I think it's a much healthier standpoint and causes fewer overreactions and over course corrections from a narrative perspective to basically look at these things and say, oh, that's new evidence. All right, like what does this say for the Bitcoin as safe haven narrative? What does this say for the Bitcoin as uncorrelated narrative versus being so fixed that narratives have that explanatory power early that we would actually shut down our belief in one or more of those narratives in the short term.
Certainly something to focus on in the way that the community addresses and perhaps markets into the future. All right, but returning back to the wider picture of central banks and their role in what the future of, I suppose, the financial system as a whole looks like, we go back to your next theme of the week, that idea of central banks coming to the rescue. And actually, a great quote you've included there in your analysis from Alex Kruger on this matter, talking about coronavirus potentially triggering a new age of fiscal policy. What do you make of this? And let's drill down into this a little bit here, Nathaniel.
Yeah, I mean, listen, central banks are going to put to the test right now of whether money printing and buoying the economy can actually solve every crisis, right? That's been our hammer for a long time now, and they're certainly going to try. And the weird thing is, in the context of a virus like this, maybe it will work, right? Maybe this will be able to buoy markets for long enough to get containment systems figured out and, have people kind of get over the initial fear and have the normalcy reset, even if it's a very weird new normal in terms of living with this virus. Like it's hard to say, basically, it's hard to predict if this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But it does feel that at some point there has to be an endpoint. Although there are folks who say there really kind of is no endpoint. And again, we live in these weird times where everything is an experiment that is basically unprecedented at this stage. Travis Kling often says that we're 10 years deep or 11 years deep into the largest monetary policy experiment in history. And I might expand that to say we're into just the 12th year of the largest policy experiment in history, the largest relationship shift between governments and money and policy across all sorts of social issues in at least modern history. And so it's very hard to know where it ends and lands, but it's going to be interesting, if nothing else.
The lens of history best viewed from afar, hard to see when you're in the thick of it. We'll have to see how this does pan out, and maybe in 10 years we'll be talking about being in the midst of this fascinating change in monetary policy experiments and policy experiments as a whole. Nathaniel Whittemore, in the meantime, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about these heady and important topics around the sphere. For those watching, stay with us at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm Westropp-Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.